Hello to everyone. We're here today in the Tier 8 Japanese aircraft carrier, the Kaga. On the map Trap, the mode is Domination. We are against an enemy Saipan, and we are in 8 to 10 matchmaking, so we do find ourselves at the bottom tier. Now, in light of the upcoming Black Friday sales that will be coming with the Thanksgiving holiday, one of the ships on offer is, of course, the Kaga B, the Black Kaga, I guess you could say. So now it seems as good a time as any to review the ship once more, just like our preface for reviewing the Jean Bar once again. Anyhow, starting off with the rocket planes of the Kaga, it uses the A6M5, so the tier 7-0 that you get as a stock plane on the Shoukaku, which is a bit of an upgrade on the A6M2 zeros that you fly off of the Ryujo, the tier 6 tech tree carrier. Again, it's a 2x4, or 2x4 setup, sorry. 8 planes in the squadron, in sum total. Really the only thing that's changed from that white 0 when you get this green 0 from the Ryujo is the overall HP and speed of the aircraft. They are a bit faster and they have a tiny bit more HP, but the rockets still have that same 28 millimeters of penetration, so not a lot of pen. And there's only, again, 4 rockets per aircraft, so in this 2x4 setup you would get 8 rockets per pass. And the overall alpha is not improved either, at only about 2200. So as a result, the rockets remain more of a utility tool. They only have 8% fire chance, and the penetration is kind of low, unlike the Ryujo where 28mm of penetration is more than enough. At tier 8, when you start seeing 32mm plating on enemy battleships, and even 30 or 50mm plates on cruisers, it does end up being a bit of a detriment. My Kitakaze here under the effects of radar fire after being harassed by the carrier. So as a result, the zeros of the A6M5 are not particularly effective. They are, however, somewhat useful for spotting since they are fast and they can set follow-up fires. Now, of course, the main draw of the Kaga, outside of being a trainer, is that she has extremely large reserves. Unlike most standard carriers, she starts with 96 aircraft on deck. This is accomplished through 24 rocket planes, the A6M50, and 36 dive bombers and torpedo bombers each. Now she does use the tier 7 aircraft found on the stock Shoukaku, so that's the B6 and Tenzin that you can see me flying here, and the D4Y3 Susei dive bomber. Now the torpedoes differ in that they have a slightly different pattern. Unlike the paired torpedo drops of the stock bomber on the Shoukaku, they are in sets of 4. The torpedo damage is also reduced at only 5400 per torpedo, unlike the 7600 or so alpha damage of each Tenzin torpedo launched by the Shoukaku. It's a fairly low HP aircraft, just shy of 2000 HP even with every HP upgrade possible. But it does come in a huge squadron with 12 aircraft in that classic 3x4 Kaga setup. And as of the removal of the quad torpedo setup on the Hakuryu some time back, it is the only remaining quadruple drop pattern torpedo bomber. Now it's not particularly fast, it accelerates to a top speed of 177 knots, cruising at about 150, so fairly standard for Japanese aircraft. But its real claim to fame is not its damage, or it's not particularly its alpha damage, but is rather its stealth, because you're able to take both Concealment Expert and Concealment Module on the Kaga, basically the only carrier that's able to do so. You can get the surface concealment down to 6.1 kilometers, which is quite stealthy. It basically gives minimal reaction time, especially if you're not air spotted like I was there. Which means that when you're attacking the targets that you should be attacking with these torpedo bombers, large, clumsy, sluggish targets, such as this Bismarck here, they have almost next to no reaction time. Not able to get too many hits there. Got a bit of a clumsy drop, and you can see here the drop does take quite a bit of time to converge after, and a lot of time to arm. These are fairly long arming distance torpedoes. So you do kind of need this low reaction time because any maneuvers will really cause that reticle to widen, which can be a bit of a problem. You saw me there twice reach for the torpedo bombers, and that is of course thanks to those deep reserves of 36 aircraft each, scoring one more hit on the Bismarck, but unable to deal enough critical damage to take him out. Enemy Des Moines diving in on my USS Kidd, and I'm going after him with the dive bombers. Now, unlike the AP dive bombers of the Ryujo and Shoukaku, these are HE dive bombers with a HE alpha of 8,800, which comes out to about 2,000 damage per bomb. Pretty classic reticle there. 6 aircraft left in this 3x4 squadron. I'm over in Ohio. Have that refresh timer. And these planes are getting absolutely shredded, but really I don't care that much. Lucky to just get that one bomb off. You can see dealing just about 1,500 damage to that saturated Ohio, but I really don't care even after losing all 12 of those Suseis, pretty much. Still have 24 more aircraft on deck, thanks to those huge Kaga reserves, and that is of course the Kaga's claim to fame. The infinite planes misnomer is, well, really not a thing. Carriers do not in fact have infinite aircrafts, but the Kaga does have extremely deep reserves, which means that, unlike most carriers, which can probably reach for the same squadron about twice per match, before being depleted of aircraft of that type, if you lose all of them, the Kaga is able to do it 3 times by default without even accounting for any regeneration over the course of the match. Now, her regeneration times are relatively poor. Trying to decide between the Kaga and the Ismo here, you can see that under the effects of AA dispersion, which slows down the narrowing of the reticle, they do take quite a bit of time to narrow in spread. Putting 3 torps and getting a flood in. Just gonna launch from long range, do a dual purpose spread here because of that. But anyway, as I was saying, you can see because of those huge deep reserves, I'm able to reach repeatedly into my torpedo bombers and use them over and over without really having any trouble. Nice 4 hits there over the 2 targets. Gonna relight that gearing with my high explosive dive bombers that I reached for very briefly. Again, the light alpha damage only does about 3,000 per bomb, a bit less than that actually, but it's more than sufficient for the likes of dealing with this gearing. You drop 4 bombs on every pass, you have that standard Japanese reticle, which actually has fairly good dispersion pattern as far as bombs go, and you can see me nailing that relatively light target fairly easily. Gonna look for that enemy Yugumo, who is out here shadowing my fleet. You can see those torpedoes, the HEDBs. 8,800 with 55mm of penetration and 50% fire chance, so fairly respectable soft stats as I find this Yugumo, light him up. Turns on his AA. Now they're fairly lightweight aircraft, especially if you don't take plane HP like I do, or don't take the dive bomber HP. And with only 4 bombs over still a relatively large HEDB reticle, they can have some limitations in accuracy. You can see my team is quite slowly losing. Hopefully I can coax this Dmitry Donskoy into assisting. Don't have a good clean pass here, so I'm actually going to stay over him, just make sure he dies. And hopefully I can get the rest of my allies to clean this up as a result. Very nice. Now I can recall. No need to go after anything with just 2 planes. Shimakaze finds a Kagero up in the north, so hopefully he can deal with that. The fact that the enemy has ships over there is definitely a dangerous sign that you are losing. Reaching for the torpedo bombers once again, you can see that 6.1 kilometer detection radius. Do bump into a Shimakaze, but unlike most Japanese torpedo bombers, which have rather excellent anti-destroyer capabilities, not because of anything in particular about how they aim, but because they do a metric ton of damage, the quadruple spread of the torpedo bombers does make them a bit awkward for handling destroyers. I'm gonna go after this low health Musashi here. Musashi does have a large amount of bulge, but hopefully I can punch through. There's quite a few ships shooting at him. My Shimakaze does go down. The Musashi is sadly still alive and does have 57 millimeters of armor plate, which means these 55 millimeter penetration bombs aren't necessarily going to guarantee me a kill. Okay, he does drop, which is good. Can turn back onto the Ohio. Gonna move my hull away. You'll note my hull, in spite of its large size, is actually quite stealthy. Ibuki over here, the one that we attacked early with rockets. Kind of lighting up the squadron. See me quickly losing aircraft, but even so I still have another full squadron of dive bombers on deck. Not a perfect hit there. It's gonna go through the channel, so I actually probably should just launch dive bombers. Don't have a good torpedo bomber aim point on that Ohio, which is going to be the target of my ire thanks to his proximity. Now the Susei does accelerate to 187 knots, so about 10 knots faster than the Tenzin torpedo bomber. And as a result is somewhat more suited for close range work. Ohio does appear to have damage controlled. Bit of an awkward reticle, but we do manage to splash 3 bombs. Not going to bother trying to turn around for another strike. He's now out and exposed, and if you can land the 4 torpedoes at 20,000 alpha per strike is a fairly good one. He does launch a fighter. Oh, actually, it's a spotter plane. You can see me kind of nudging this reticle over. Very widespread, which of course does make it ill-suited for anti-cruiser and anti-destroyer work, but it is more than sufficient for anti-battleship work. You can see me in this bottom-tier game, still attacking these tier 10 ships, and not having too much trouble with my reserves overall. We lose yet another ship, but hopefully I can help to dispatch this Ohio, as you do see me land enough torpedoes to get in on the action. Now we do need to reclaim the cap lead, but we are up ships for the most part now. It's just that exposed Ibuki going after him with my dive bombers, and you can see me just now, 13 minutes into the match, as a bottom tier Kaga with tier 7 aircraft, which obviously adds to their relative fragility. Only just now starting to run out of aircraft. My Donskoy coming after me, or coming after the enemy carrier. Hopefully I can help my Goliath to clean these up. Now I'm going to go after the Ibuki first, because I can deal with the Shimakaze with rocket planes if necessary. Whereas this Ibuki is a bit heavier and poses a larger threat to me. Scoring 1 clean hit. The Ibuki, of course, not particularly threatening in terms of AA. Shimakaze continuing to push forward. Ibuki does stop inside of the smoke cloud, so I'm gonna just push forward and press onto this Shimakaze. Do manage to score a hit there, and now it's down to the zeros. We've had the zeros ready for a while. My Shimakaze does score a lovely double strike, and that leaves just the Saipan on the run. Now, given it's a Saipan, I'm gonna actually recall the Saipan is particularly notable for having pretty poor AA. And as my Dmitry Donskoy does finish up the Saipan, that is going to be enough to wrap up this match. Pretty decent results overall, not particularly special, but you did get to see me make use of those extremely deep Kaga reserves over the course of this tier 10 match, finishing at 129,000 damage, just shy of 130,000, with 19 torpedo hits, 14 bomb hits, and 7 rocket hits. You can see those extremely deep reserves of the Kaga, allowing me to kind of ignore my rocket planes after the initial scouting, so even in spite of their relative mediocrity, it doesn't really matter because you don't have to reach for those rockets unless you absolutely have to use them. In some case, the combination of powerful anti-heavy surface ship torpedoes that you can reach for over and over to deal with big battleships and slower, larger cruisers, and the relatively more precise high explosive dive bombers allows you to kind of ignore those mediocre rockets unless you really need to use them to either clear a escorting fighter consumable, just suicide the rocket planes in to clear the fighter by letting them tag on, or you need some extra position because you're against a rather nimble destroyer, which is avoiding your HEDBs, which can be a thing. As I mentioned, when you only drop 4 bombs with a relatively large reticle, you can miss a lot of your bombs. Sorry. Outside of the munitions, of course, 3 plane kills by hull, 2 by fighter, 6 incapacitations, or 8 incapacitations. Sorry, can't read. 2 kills, 3 fires, and 3 floods, along with 12 spotting ribbons. If we go up to the team score-wise, not too shabby at 2150 base experience. Moving on to the detailed report. Unsurprisingly, the bulk of my damage coming from the torpedoes. The rockets, as I mentioned, are pretty much, they're not useless per se, but they're not particularly useful. The Ryujo actually gets a lot of use out of her rockets at tier 6, which are functionally identical, but because of the different matchmaking that you experience at tier 8, especially when you get up tiered like here, the rockets tend to lose a lot of their utility in comparison, and the amount of alpha damage they can dish out to even destroyers becomes quite a bit lower. 74,000 torpedo alpha and 24,000 bomb alpha, kind of showing off the difference, even though the Tenzin torpedo bomber on the Kaga does carry a smaller warhead than that of the Shoukaku, only dealing 5,400 damage as opposed to the 7,600 of the Shoukaku. If you compare here on the aircraft, sorry, there's a bit of lag on this patch client. So you can see here my torpedoes only hit for 5,400, doing 53 knots with my current build. And if you compare them against the Shoukaku's 7,200, they do quite a bit less, but do keep in mind that you drop 2 torpedoes at a time on each Shoukaku pass. So you have about 1,400 alpha, whereas the full alpha of the Kaga's quadruple torpedo spread is just about 21,000. This is, of course, the bread and butter of the Kaga, which is why you saw me reach for those torpedo bombers into those deep reserves over and over. The bombers, as I used several times, are mostly there to just set follow-up fires on either targets that have already been lit on fire by your teammates, targets that you lit on fire with your rockets, or targets that you flooded with your torpedo bombers that you can kind of try and set fires, follow-up fires on. The 8,800 alpha is pretty good against cruisers and destroyers, but versus battleship type targets, you will find that alpha damage starts to be a bit insignificant in comparison. So it's still a pretty good HE bomb with 55mm of penetration and 50% fire chance, but certainly not the heavier bomb that you can find on the Lexington. By comparison, the Helldiver on the Lexington is quite a bit slower. It only reaches a maximum speed of 164 knots as opposed to 187. But it does have a maximum bomb damage of 9,200, which translates to about 3,100 damage per bomb, as opposed to the 8,800, which ends up giving you just about 2,800 per bomb. So it's not that large of a difference, about 300 damage per bomb, but keep in mind that the 3x3 Helldiver squadron does drop 6 bombs per pass, which gives them a total theoretical unsaturated HE alpha of 1,800. More or less, whereas your full Kaga damage is going to hover just about 11,000, so it's a 5,000 or so difference in how much damage you can inflict at once, thanks to that single bomber. As well, they have reticles that are about the same size in terms of the drop reticle, but you're dropping only 4 bombs as compared to 6 on the Lexington, so the accuracy is also somewhat more suspect. Similar penetration, I think the Lexington bombs have 53mm of penetration, not quite reaching that 60. I said 63, sorry. The Lexington has 53mm of penetration, so you're not quite at that 63 of the Midway's bombs yet. So the Suseis do end up having superior armor penetration, but that's not really a relevant armor bracket in World of Warships. There's 50 and 60, and then both Lexington bombs and Kaga bombs beat all the 40 and 45mm armor sections and don't get up to the 60mm armor sections, so largely comparable. They do have that good 50% fire chance, but again, only 4 bombs, so it can be a bit hit or miss in terms of whether or not the bombers are effective. Overall, a fairly good package, and so the Kaga shifts away from the Shoukaku, which is kind of equipped to deal with all types of targets. The Shoukaku is quite possibly one of the most versatile carriers at tier 8. Not quite as versatile as the HEDB equipped Lexington, but still pretty up there. Her bombers are quite a bit more durable. You can see 1,800, 2,000, and 1,500 or 1,600 or so on her aircraft. But the Shoukaku has vastly superior rockets with the N1K2 Shininkai. Again, only 28mm and 2200 alpha per rocket, but you end up launching 6 rockets per plane on a 3x3 setup, so 18 rockets as opposed to 8, dealing the same damage, so more than double the capacity for damage on the rockets. And the individual torpedoes, while they don't have as high of an alpha strike on large targets, do travel in a much more narrow twin spread setup, which is a lot easier to aim at nimble targets, and is mounted on a better aircraft platform in the B7A Ryusei, which reaches the same peak speed of 177 knots, but is quite a bit more durable and regenerates a bit faster, the Kaga having those relatively mediocre regeneration speeds. And then the dive bomber is an AP dive bomber, so it's more suited for heavier targets than the Kaga, but it can also inflict quite heavy damage onto cruisers if they misposition, and that damage tends to be unhealable, which, especially if you're attacking higher tier targets, such as at Ibuki, for example, that we saw in the last game, can be quite a boon. The armor-piercing bombs also have the tendency to break engines and break other modules on the surface targets that they attack, whereas these relatively small 500-pound general-purpose bombs found on the Kaga's D4Ys do tend to inflict more damage to AA mounts and turrets and the like, but do less module damage overall, so they don't have the benefit of potentially crippling the target and putting them dead in the water, which is one of the very understated features of the AP dive bombers. Kaga's overall hull fairly large. In spite of that large hull, however, because of the modules you're able to take, she is fairly stealthy, which is underrated as well. 9.9 kilometers. She is rather slow at 28 knots as opposed to the Shoukaku's fairly swift 33 knots, if I'm not mistaken. No, 34 knots actually, so she is quite a bit slower. She does end up being stealthier because of the module loadout. Shoukaku sitting at a healthy 10.8 with her full standard build. But largely ineffective are stealthy Japanese carriers. The Kaga will have more difficulty repositioning, however, because of that slower speed and a colossal turning circle of 1,080 meters. Moving on to the modules. Fairly standard modules for the Kaga. The only real choices are in slots 3 and 4, and then everything else is fairly standard as far as the Kaga goes. So slots 1 and 2, standard carrier upgrades, take your aircraft engines modification 1 and your aircraft air groups modification 1. The other modules available in those slots are absolutely useless for carriers, and in slot 5 is straightforward as well. Most carriers will take flight control modification 1, basically every carrier other than the Kaga, but the Kaga has the unique distinction of having more aircraft than God, so to say. She does in fact start with 96 aircraft on deck, so moving from 96 aircraft up to the 102 aircraft that you would get if you take the flight control mod is not particularly helpful. She does have below average regeneration time, so you can see the 94-second regeneration time and 86-second regeneration time on her rocket and torpedo bombers. Compare that to the 65 seconds and 70 seconds found on the Shoukaku, fairly long. So the 5% regeneration time would be nice, but overall you don't take the module for the extra regen time, you take the module for the extra deck places available, and the Kaga definitely does not need them. Instead, it's better to take concealment modules so that you can operate further forward, get that concealment down to that nice 9.9 kilometers on your hull, but more importantly, it drops your B6N Tenzins down to 6.1 kilometers of detectability radius, which allows you to do some nasty things, getting right on top of a target without them noticing, which is definitely extremely important to the Kaga's playstyle thanks to that sluggish and wide quadruple torpedo drop pattern. So those are the 3 straightforward modules. For slot 3, I'm currently opting for aerial torpedoes because of my captain build, so this gives 5% torpedo speed. However, if you take torpedo acceleration on your captain, you don't want to take this module because one of the understated facts, or not stated facts, of taking any kind of torpedo speed modules is that it increases the arming distance on your torpedoes, and the arming distance on the Kaga's torpedoes is already extremely long. Increasing it any further poses a significant amount of risk that there will be situations where you literally cannot drop a ship because there's not enough room between the ship and any terrain that's nearby. If you don't take torpedo acceleration, then I recommend taking torpedo speed. If you take torpedo acceleration on your captain, I recommend taking torpedo bomber attack time instead. Slot 4 is also optional. I'm currently taking torpedo bomber's modification 2 to add health to the Tenzins. The torpedo bombers do deal the bulk of your damage when you're having a successful game, so putting as much HP onto them as possible is my preferred means of using them. However, the torpedo bombers, like most torpedo bombers in the game, do have access to this heal repair party consumable. So as a result, some people might argue that taking the more standard module of bomber HP might be more valid. Both options are perfectly fine. I'm just telling you that even though I usually will take bomber's modification, this is what I do take on my Shoukaku, for example. Because of how hard... Oh, actually I don't. Okay, I just straight lied to your faces, but I do take it on the Hakuryu. But these are cases of carriers where the dive bombers are extremely powerful, whereas the Kaga's dive bombers, while being more than sufficient for doing the job of lighting fires and dealing some supplemental HE damage, are more of a sideshow, so I prefer not to put the HP on and just go all in on those excellent torpedo bombers of the Kaga. Captain-wise, this is one of my Hakuryu captains. This is the standard Hakuryu captain, actually. This is the cookie cutter build. If you don't really know how you want to customize your build, this is the standard way to do it in this day and age. So I used to take torpedo acceleration on my Japanese carriers to push those 50 knot torpedoes up to 55 knots just for anti-destroyer duties, but now you can take that torpedo module, which by itself adds 3 knots of speed. As a result, I've modified that Core 9 build setup so that I go plain regeneration into plain speed into armor and survivability expert. If you take torpedo acceleration, it's perfectly fine. You just end up not taking these 2 1-pointers and you get that extra 5 seconds of aiming time with that module on your torpedo bombers. Now after your Core 9 skills, the most important skill is to take sight stabilization. For Japanese carriers in particular, the carrier hulls tend to be fairly stealthy, so getting that extra arm time, especially on armor piercing dive bombers on a tech tree, or in this case an extra arm time, I mean reduced arm time on the dive bombers and even these relatively sluggish torpedo bombers on the Kaga is extremely helpful, especially when you're pushing through high tier AA, which can tend to be very heavy, so you really want to arm that drop and get that attack off as soon as possible to minimize your losses. So followed up with sight stabilization, that puts you to 13 points. From there, I would probably recommend taking, if you are insistent on making a Kaga dedicated captain, Last Gasp is actually quite excellent on the Kaga, unlike the Shoukaku or the Hakuryu, which has a rather large torpedo bomber squadron and dive bomb squadron, which is not able to very well make use of Last Gasp. The squadrons of the Kaga being separated into 3 on her torpedo bombers and dive bombers makes Last Gasp quite useful, so you can go for that for your 14th point. If you choose not to go for that 14th point, however, go into Concealment Expert to get that reduced reaction time on your torpedo bombers and better hull concealment, as I mentioned, for all those reasons of just bringing down the Tenzin and Kaga hull concealment. And then finish up with improved engines and Last Gasp in that case. There is something to be said for taking Demolition Expert. The Kaga is, of course, a carrier that does have access to high explosive rockets and bombs. However, thanks to the low number of rockets and low number of bombs launched, I don't find it to be particularly efficient, and if you do share the captain with a tech tree carrier like the Hakuryu, you're only going to be buffing your rockets with 3 points, and that's just not a great exchange of captain points overall. And I would be remiss if I left off without going over the overall survivability. The Kaga is a fairly large carrier and a slow carrier, and what this means is that you're a huge target. So hopefully you would hope that you have some kind of armor, especially given that the Kaga is built on a battleship hull. However, that's not really the case. You can see she's covered in 19mm side plate and 21mm deck, so you can shatter destroyer HE on your deck only, and everything else takes damage even from destroyers, and you are a huge target. And if I strip away the surface armor, you can see the Kaga has a fairly prominent citadel, so you will take citadels from long-range cruiser and battleship fire, so try not to get shot at. You're a very large carrier, so be very careful about where you position that hull. Now, in terms of raw HP and torpedo bulge, she does have a significant bulge at 22% and 57,000 hit points, which compares relatively favorably to the Shoukaku. Shoukaku has a bit less in terms of HP, but a slightly better bulge. It's also similarly almost unarmored, with only that belt armor and a similarly exposed citadel, which is quite accessible. Even has only 25 millimeters of citadel deck, so fairly similar, but do note that the Shoukaku is much, much smaller, and also does 34 knots as opposed to your 28 knots, so they are comparable in survivability, but overall the Shoukaku actually gets better points in terms of survivability, especially because it has a marginally better AA defense. Both ships have pretty bad AA, especially as far as carriers go. 153 continuous is not going to stop any kinds of squadrons. At tier 8, you're really relying on that self-defense cap fighter. Anyhow, not really a deep dive, but a fairly specific run over of the Kaga in preparation for those Black Friday sales. In terms of my impressions of the premium carriers currently available between the Kaga, Saipan, and Indomitable, and Graf Zeppelin at tier 8, the Kaga is probably one of the strongest. The Graf Zeppelin and Saipan have been nerfed pretty heavily by global changes and various other things. The Graf Zeppelin in particular suffering from some interesting changes to our armor-piercing dive bombers, which make them relatively ineffectual. And the Saipan being quite heavily affected by the rocket reticle changes, which, well, they did affect the Kaga's rockets. The Kaga's rockets were never one of her selling points anyway, so she doesn't really care. And the Indomitable is, of course, a very specialized carrier that's not for everyone. So overall, the Kaga is the best of the bunch if you're going to purchase a tier 8 carrier. So that's my overall assessment. So if you are looking to get a discounted Kaga in all black, I'm sure it looks quite spiffy. I don't have a Kaga B, obviously. I'm not a super tester, but if you look at the Graf Zeppelin B, I can assure you that having planes that are all black is kind of cool. And I believe the Black Friday ships typically do come at a 30% discount over the normal price, so if you're looking for a Japanese carrier captain trainer, the Kaga B might be just what you're looking for. She is, of course, the only currently available Japanese carrier trainer, and she does a pretty good job of it. She can use that standard carrier captain, or you can customize a little further for however you want with Demolition Expert, or maybe not taking site stabilization, if that is your preference. So yeah, there was that Kaga in that bottom tier game. When you're top tier, of course, this carrier is an absolute monster. You essentially never will run out of aircraft unless you are doing something very wrong. But even the Kaga with those huge reserves is extremely forgiving of mistakes. So really, it's an almost foolproof carrier design, at least in the current iteration of the game. She has tools to deal with pretty much any type of surface ship because she has access to those high explosive dive bombers and not particularly special but usable rocket planes, and of course the excellent torpedo bomber. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I will catch you all later. Cheers and best of luck with those torpedo bombing attacks.